Enroll your child for the manifested e-learning platform and see their grades grow tremendously. These videos can be downloaded to a laptop for offline viewing or viewed from a smartphone in a cost-friendly format.
Welcome to Manifested e-learning. We are going to have a lesson in history and government. We are having a lesson in history and government. History and government. That is our subject that we are studying today. And we are going to be looking at the topic, continuation of the topic, introduction. Introduction to history and government. That is the topic that we are looking at. And in this lesson, we are going to be looking at the sources. Sources of information. Information on history and government. That is what we are going to be looking at in our lesson today. So my dear learner, in the previous lessons we introduced our topic by defining what history is. We also defined what government is. Are you able to remember what we defined history to be? Right? Can you try to define what history is? Yes? History, we said, is a study of man's past events in a chronological order. It is a study of man's past events in a chronological order. And we looked at the different periods in history. We said there is prehistory. There is what? What else? History itself. And then we looked at the different aspects or branches of history. We said there are 3 branches of history. Can you remember them? The 3 branches of history. Can you mention them? Very good. We have economic history. We have social history. We have political history. We also defined the term government. And we said the term government comes from the word govern, which means to exercise control. So we said government is a group of people who exercise control or direct the affairs of a specific nation or state. And they are given this mandate by the people of that country. So that is a government. And we looked at the different forms of government we have in the world. Can you remember the forms of the government we have in the world? We have aristocratic government. We have monarchical government. And we said monarchical governments, we have 2 types of monarchical governments. Absolute monarchy. And then the other one was what? Which was the other form of monarchy apart from absolute? Yes, constitutional monarchy. And then we said the other form of government or type of government we have a dictatorial type of government where the leader, right? The leader is the law. Whatever that person says is what is followed by the people of that nation. Then we looked at a democratic government, the type of government we have in Kenya today. The citizens of that nation or of that state are involved in appointing or electing the leaders or the group of leaders that are going to lead them. The affairs of the people are put in consideration in a democratic government. So our learners, or my dear learner, today, we are going to look at the sources of information on history and government. So we said history is a study of past events, while government is a study, or it's a group of people, right, who lead. Now, as a historian or as a researcher, where do you get information concerning people, right, concerning governments? Where do you get this information to make or to make decisions or to learn about the history of a given people or the government in a given country or the government in a given group of people? So that is the question that we are going to be answering in our lesson today. So let us look at the lesson objectives. By the end of this lesson, what are you, my dear learner, supposed to have accomplished? So the lesson objectives for this lesson. So by the end of this lesson, number one, you should be able to identify the categories of information on history and government. The categories of information on history and government. And then number two, you should be able to explain the unwritten sources of information. Which are the different sources of unwritten information do we have, right? So that is what we are going to be looking at. So to start us off, what are the different categories of information do we have in history and government? So information in history and government is divided into three categories. So sources of information are divided into three categories of sources. So the sources of information, we can categorize them into three levels, right? We have, I've said three. The first one, we call it unwritten sources. Number two, we have written sources. And then number three, we have electronic sources. So my dear learner, I want you to be very careful here. We are talking of categories of sources, not sources of information. So the sources, the varied sources we have of information on history and government can be categorized into three: unwritten sources, and then we have written sources and electronic sources. What do I mean by the categories? Let me use an example of what sources of water do we have in our societies today. What sources of water do we have in our societies today? Right? You can get water from rivers. You can get water from taps. You can get water from boreholes, right? Where else do we get water? You can get water from rain, right? We can get water from man-made dams, right? But now, all these sources of water can be categorized into two groups: natural sources of water and man-made sources of water, right? So when you talk of natural sources of water, you talk of rain, talk of rivers, right? Man has no control over them. But when you talk of man-made sources of water, you can talk of water in taps that has been directed into taps. That is a human intervention. So when you are asked of a source of water, you cannot say man-made source, right? You have to mention the specific source. That is the same case when you talk of categories of sources of information on history and government. That is a mistake most learners make. So when you are asked to give sources of information, you do not talk of unwritten sources. You have to mention what is this unwritten source, as we are going to be discussing in our lesson. So let us trickle down and look at these categories. So we start with number one, the unwritten sources of information. Unwritten sources. Unwritten sources. So when you talk of unwritten sources, that means it is a source that is not recorded down. It is information that is not recorded down anywhere, right? So it is unrecorded. Unrecorded. You cannot find it on a paper. You cannot find it written down on a scroll somewhere. You cannot find it on a television. You cannot find that information anywhere that is recorded, right? So what are these unwritten sources? So unwritten sources can be further. So these are the unwritten sources of information. The first one, we have, let us just list them down and then we shall discuss them as we go by, looking at the advantages and disadvantages. So the first source is oral traditions. Oral tradition. That is the first unrecorded or unwritten source of information. We have oral traditions. Oral traditions. And then number two, we have linguistics. Linguistics, right? Yes, not worry about the terms. We are going to be discussing them. We have linguistics. And then number three, we have archaeology. Archaeology. Then number four, we have anthropology. These are all disciplines in history, but we are going to be looking at them and discussing each and every one of them one at a time. Anthropology, and then lastly we shall have genetics. Genetics as a source of unwritten history. So, my dear learner, these are the unwritten sources of information. We have oral traditions. You can go with me. Then we have linguistics. Number three, archaeology. We have anthropology. And then we have genetics. So, my dear learners, let us start with the first one, which is oral traditions. Oral traditions. What are oral traditions? What is oral tradition? So we can say it is information acquired by word of mouth. It is information that is acquired and passed by word of mouth. By word of mouth. That means you just talk about it. Information is passed from one person to the other by word of mouth, from one generation to the other. How can you pass information from one person to the other through just word of mouth? So that can be done through, these are the examples of the oral traditions we have in the society today. We have songs. So you have heard of songs that are educative, right? Songs that talk about a certain good moral value. Songs that teach people how to cook, right? Even today, as we are talking of the COVID-19 disease, there is a song that has been done to encourage people to wash their hands, right? I know you know it as learners, right? How you are supposed to wash your hands, palm to palm, finger to finger, right? That song, it teaches you something, or it passes information. That is song. Other ways in which information is passed in oral traditions, we have legends. Legends. What is a legend? This is a story talking about somebody who is important. For example, we have among the people of Nyanza, we have the story of Luanda Magere, right? So in that story, they will talk of a hero who fought on behalf of a community. That is a legend. Another example, we have myths or myths. These are stories that explain natural occurrences. For example, where did human beings come from? We have myths explaining the source of human beings or the existence of a human being, right? So in the communities, every community will have a story explaining where they came from. For example, among the Gikuyu, they talk of they came from Gikuyu and Mombi. That is a myth according to them, right? That is their source. You have heard other myths explaining, for example, why do we have the rainbow, right? Yeah. So you can find out from your community, how do they explain the existence of different things or activities in the society. That is a myth. So you'll find from one generation to the other, this information is passed down. So as you grow up, you just know something, a specific thing exists because you are told. You are not there, but the story that is passed down from one generation to the other explains, right, that information. So historians can find these stories that are told among the society to get information. And then we can also talk of poems, right? Poems. Poems, right? We have riddles, right? You have tongue twisters, right? These are different words that have specific information. For example, somebody can create a poem detailing out a specific event. People can create tongue twisters explaining certain phenomena in the society. So that is oral sources of oral traditions. You can talk of many other things. You can talk of folk tales, right? You have word games, right? When young children are playing, you will hear them using different words to pass information. You might not even understand because you are not part of that group. But so among themselves, they understand each other. Information is passed among them, right? So that is oral tradition. It has to be information that is acquired and passed by word of mouth. Word of mouth. it is very important when you talk of oral tradition. It is word of mouth. I want you to note that carefully. Word of mouth. So, what are the advantages and the disadvantages of using such a source of information? Because now, as a historian, you will come and find out from these songs of this community, what do they tell us about the history of these people? From the myths they have, what are their belief systems? So let us look at what are the advantages and disadvantages of using oral traditions as a source of information on history and government. So let us start with the advantages. The advantages of using oral traditions as a source of information on history and government. The advantages of using oral tradition as a source of information to history and government. So, number one, we can say it is cheap. It is cheap compared to other sources. It is cheap compared to other sources. For example, as you are going to study genetics, because you do not need a lot of money for you to study a myth in a specific community. And then number two, it complements other sources. It complements other sources. And then number three, it is important. While studying prehistory. And remember, we said prehistory is the period where man had not invented writing as a way of storing information. So for us to get information during prehistory, the most convenient method is oral tradition. And then lastly, they integrate the study of history with other studies. So it integrates with other studies. So through oral history, you are able even to study other parts or other social studies. So what are the shortcomings? Though these are the advantages. Now, what are the shortcomings or limitations or disadvantages? Disadvantage. Stroke limitation. Or another word that can be used, shortcoming. Shortcoming of using oral tradition. Of oral tradition. So number one, we said, remember here, I want you to refer here. We said it is information that is passed by word of mouth. That means it relies on the mental capacity of a person to remember details of a certain thing, right? So what is the risk of that? It can be biased. So that is the first shortcoming of using oral tradition. It can be biased. That means the person who is passing the information decides what information to pass on to the next person. That is biased. So if I just want you to have the correct information or the positive information, I can do away with the negative information. That is the first disadvantage. And then number 2, the accuracy. The accuracy of the information. The accuracy of the information depends on the memory. The memory of the narrator. The accuracy of the information depends on the memory of the narrator. So if the narrator has a very good memory, they will remember all the details, right? But if the information or the narrator is not very good in his memory, some information can be forgotten. And then number 3, the information can be exaggerated. The information can be exaggerated. That means a person will want to say that which is positive to them. You can be able to manipulate the information to suit your own position, right? And then it is not possible to give exact dates. That is the next shortcoming. It is not possible to give the exact dates of events. For example, if we are talking of something that happened almost 100 years ago, as the information is passed out, it's not possible to really pinpoint this is the exact date that an event happened in history. Are you together, my dear learner? So those are the advantages and disadvantages. So you can also, through further study, you can also be able to find out more advantages and disadvantages of using these method or this source of information. So my dear learners, as we come to the end of our lesson today, we have looked at the sources of information to history and government, and we have categorized the sources into unwritten, written, and electronic sources. And we have started discussing what are the unwritten sources. We have said unwritten sources are that information which is not recorded down. And we gave examples, that is oral traditions, linguistics, archaeology, anthropology, and genetics. So to start us off, we have looked at what oral traditions is, right? And we have looked at its advantages and its disadvantage as a source of information. So my dear learner, I want you to note down a revision question that is going to help you as you revise for today's lesson. So I want you to note down this revision question for you for this lesson. So we have a revision question. A revision question. And these are the question. Identify the advantages and disadvantages advantages and disadvantages of oral tradition as a source of information on history and government. Identify the advantages and disadvantages of oral tradition as a source of information on history and government. That is very simple. We have discussed the different advantages and disadvantages of using oral tradition as a source of information on history and government. So my dear learner, I hope you have enjoyed the lesson and you have learned a new thing on history and government. So until our next lesson, it's goodbye for now.